I get this in my... Hey, John. Hey, John. I'm well, and how are you?
Good. See you.
So you're going to hear about the geometry of emotions, huh?
Yes. I'm going to take it all in.
All right.
Follow Chris. His brain. We can do it, right, Chris?
If you're ready,
I'm going to introduce you.
yeah, why don't you? And I'll just get out of the way here.
Well, I'm going to wait one more minute because we have one more minute.
Okay.
What? Coffee? No. How are you? Good. Almost done with your first semester?
Yes. It's very good actually next week. And then she did come yesterday. Oh. Thank you. Introduce you to Emily. Oh, yeah. Group therapist, psychotherapist, first, and movement therapist.
Checked. We are recording, so that's good news. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get started if you want to find a seat. Thank you. My name's Kara Feldman Hunt. I am the program manager for UVM Integrative Health, which is a joint endeavor between the UVM Medical Center, the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, and the College of Medicine. And this is our Community Integrative Practitioner Forum. And those of you who come to all of these, you've heard me say this a million times, so I'm sorry, same thing. We do offer CMEs for this, and you can go on to the UVM My Credits to find the series and claim your credit if you want to. We have parking passes back there if you want to grab a parking pass. And let's see. Our next forum will be on December 6th. It's on integrative approaches for trauma-informed care, and that's a panel presentation. So hopefully you can join us for that. If you registered for this event, you will be added to our mailing list so you get notices about future events. And the idea behind this, what's going on here? Sorry, I'm hearing...
There's something
feedback
coming over here.
Okay, sorry, let's just take a second to figure that out.
There's someone talking.
There is some talking. Okay. How's that? I think that worked. Sorry, I'm also the technical person here.
Can
and
you
I'm not that
restart me
technical.
here?
I am. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. So anyway, the idea here is a conversation starter. This series does not necessarily represent the UVM Medical Center, but we really hope that this is an opportunity to open some minds and start a conversation. And I want to introduce Dr. Chris Chase. He practiced anesthesiology here for 4 decades. Is that true?
Yeah.
Wow. He directed and published multiple NIH-funded investigations during that time. He also conducted and published research in medical acupuncture for 12 years. He is a qualified medical acupuncturist and a member of the American Academy of Medical Acupuncture. Part of this medical acupuncture research led to the development of a geometry of emotions roadmap and a full-length book, How to Bridge Gaps and Resolve Conflicts, which we're going to hear about tonight. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Once I get the hang of this, we're going to be good. Let's see. I have no financial disclosures. You have to say that. And she already mentioned, Kara mentioned that I have done quite a bit of research here And what we're going to hear about tonight is in a paper that I wrote in August. I wrote it before that, but it came out at the end of August in the Journal of Medical Acupuncture. And to give you a little background behind this, when I first developed the skill in acupuncture, every once in a while someone would grab me and say, would you come over to the recovery room and see if you could help this woman? She's in terrible pain and she has nausea. And obediently I would go over and I would put some needles in and she would get better. Most of the time they got better. And I remember one evening there was a woman in the intensive care unit of all places, and she had a flail chest. That's an injury that happens when you've been in an auto accident and you break the ribs on both sides. So when you breathe in, the chest collapses and you get a pneumonia underneath this. And she did not want to have a breathing tube. They asked me, would I try to help her? And I went ahead and put some acupuncture needles in, and lo and behold, it seemed to help her a lot. And then the next thing we knew, we were giving Narcan because with the narcotic she already had on board, she needed to keep on breathing. But she did very well. I treated her several times, and invariably, after every one of these instances, my colleagues who are all Western trained would look at me and they'd say, Chris, what are you doing? Why is this working? And then I would say to them, well, you see, we have this idea, this 5-phase theory, and I would just watch their lids just go down just like this. And I realized that if I could, I should try to develop a kind of a new approach to explaining why acupuncture worked, and maybe a model that everyone could use, whether you're a medical acupuncturist or not. And we're going to hear about this alternative 5-phase model. And much of it comes from the work of a guy named John Cross. But that's what this talk is about tonight, is about that model and what it means. And I'm prepared to be flexible if I need to fit the time here, because I want to have time for questions. But if I had to be forced into learning objectives, since that's the way we deal with things these days, I will provide an introduction to the human chakra energy centers of the human aura. It helps to organize this model. But believe it or not, they are not necessary to use it. You can be a Western doc in this audience. You might be a nurse in a school. You might be a mom or a dad who has a busy schedule and employees that are fighting. And what I will show you tonight doesn't depend on you believing in chakras, but it does help organize things. So there's a differentiation there I want you to know. And then there's to provide an introduction to the chakra archetypes. In literature, as you know, there are character types. And we know some of these character types. Like if I say the word Frankenstein, that immediately gets everyone interested because that's one of the famous character types in literature. But it's possible to look medically and have archetypes. And this has been done several times. In the world of 5-phase theory, this is the first time this has been done this way. It has been done by some other people you'll hear about, but this treatment is fairly unique. And then using what we built, I'm going to present a couple of cases that may help you to understand how that's useful, not only for the acupuncturist or the physician, but it's very useful for the patient that has the illness in helping them understand what's happening to them. Because I can tell you, after 40 years of medical practice, and I can't believe I got there. I just cannot imagine that 40 years went by, but it did. Half the battle is getting that empathetic connection with that patient to believe in what is offered. If you can't get there, you're on the 10-yard line, there's 20 seconds left, and you've got to get all the way to the other end of the field. But if you have that patient believing in this, then you've got a head start. And this model will help that because the patient can see it. It's not so advanced that you have to know physical chemistry or anything like that. I want to get away from the idea that we have the Western medicine over here, we have the Eastern medicine over here, and the two aren't talking. This is supposed to be a model where they meet together. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go forward. So when we talk about this topic, I wrote some things down that I thought probably you should know, because chakras helped organize this approach that I've taken, this model. People have been talking about chakras for a long time. This goes all the way back to 600 BC that it's at least written about. And part of this, in terms of five-phase theory, is that we talk about these basic elements like water, earth, metal, fire. See, I left fire out there. And what we're going to do is put these two disciplines together. I've talked about how I want the East to meet the West. I usually make my talks, and I know what I want to say, and then when it comes out at the right time, it comes out. So that's the way I talk. And what I'm going to show you, rather than take 40 minutes to build this thing, I want you to see the end product. And at one time, I was an instrument-rated pilot, and one thing about IFR charts is they really look terribly busy until you know how they're put together. And then once you know how they're put together, you realize everything on there has something to do with keeping you alive. So what we're going to look at is this planar surface on which I've put everything, but really it's because they've been collapsed down one on another. At the very top level is this concept of chakras and thoughts and emotion and spirituality. The next level is meridians, the meridians in our nervous system. And this includes the CNS, the periphery, the nerve ganglia, autonomic nervous system. And then finally at the bottom, it's the meat and the potatoes. It's the anatomy, the muscles, the bones, the organs, the blood, the physiology. So if I can just show you a little segment from this emotions map that you're going to see in the next slide. I took a little window. I love it, where you can just, on a Mac, you just take it, you have this big screen, you can just take out this little piece. So I took out this little piece. And the way this is organized is the muscles associated with one of the vertices of a pentagon are at the very top. And then there are the organs. These numbers are the chakra numbers. This right here, that's the tone B. The entire world, whether you know it or not, is vibrating. It doesn't feel that way, but it is. And I can tell you that because as an undergraduate, I didn't have the usual major going into med school. I majored in applied mathematics, physical chemistry with a strong minor. And we would sit there, and if you wanted to run a computer program, you had to go use the card reader. We didn't have remote terminals. It was a pain. But we had our little HP calculators, and we would solve these partial differential equations, and we would sit there and do these polar coordinate graphs that showed these orbits potentially of where an electron was around a nucleus. It was really wonderful. It helped me understand the world. But I can tell you that all of these things are in a constant mode of vibration. Your entire body is. Everything you sit on is. And some parts of your body will resonate. That means that they are at the same wavelength and frequency as something else. And so these tones are mentioned here because there's a way of looking at chakras by using tuning forks. We'll get to it. And then here's your chakra number, your endocrine connection, your nerve plexus connection. These are meridians. The little thing here that stands for small intestine meridian. You don't have to know this, but that's what those are. Then here are the names of the chakras. Heart's number 4, crown number 7, in this part of the diagram. And it's part of the energy fire phase. I renamed all of the traditional phases of five-phase theory because I didn't want people to confuse this with classic Chinese. So I had to rename my phases. so that when someone looked at my pentagon, they knew they were in a different world. And do we have medical acupuncturists with us tonight? Is anybody a medical acupuncturist here? Because it will save me some time if I don't have to address some of these exceptions, because you probably won't know they're there. But if there are acupuncturists here, I'm happy to do that. Then there's a list of negative emotions, positive emotions. And these arrows here are chakras, are organs. They are not in isolation. They influence each other. We're like a little community that's all supposed to get along together well, and when we're energy balanced, we have health. So these little arrows here, they represent. Oh, boy. Okay. I thought I could. I thought that was the... All right, so right here, that arrow is what's called a co-cycle. It goes down here, and there's another chakra there. And then I was talking about the negative emotions, the positive emotions, the names of the chakras. Here are the meridians. This is the node number. This is the tone. Here are the organs and major nervous structures right here. These are the muscles. And there's another arrow associated with a Shen cycle. When it is on the outside of the pentagon, it's called Shen cycle. When it goes across the middle, it's called a co-cycle. So this little piece is going to be repeated over and over again. Now, because things influence each other, I thought it would be interesting if we looked at an example of how one section in this diagram might influence another, and how that might influence health outcomes, if you're with me on this. So if we look right here, and this isn't quite as in focus, at least it doesn't seem to me, and I know my vision's excellent, so I don't know how to make it a better focus, but it doesn't seem to me like it's focused the way it ought to be. Anyway, these emotions, I brought them out so you could see: anxiety, fear, scarcity, doubt, a sense of not belonging. This is at what is called the root. And the root is really our tribe. It's how we identify. It's where we grow up. And what happens when we don't feel like we're belonging? Well, that has some influences. One of them is it leads to anger. We tend to be very discontented and go into ourselves. And at the same time here, we might be uncaring, prideful. So this isn't a good thing. And over here, you can see more pensive, envious, low self-esteem, depressed. So all of this comes from here. And then the reaction to that, and I'll go into this in a little detail, is that it's working now. What happens if you're chronically angry is that there is a fundamental reflex in the human brain. The amygdala, which is our source of emotional memory, actually can take over and influence our behaviors because it robs blood flow to the cortex. And what happens when that occurs is that there are compounds released by the hypothalamus and the pituitary after that stimulate the adrenal gland, and that adrenal gland releases epinephrine and steroids. And this is a well-known syndrome. It's called adrenal cortical syndrome. It's been identified for a long, long time. And this is what is being predicted by this model, and lo and behold, it actually happens. Another thing that we can see in this has been also documented in what was called the adverse child experience study. Children that are really deprived of a normal emotional upbringing. It can be a divorce. It can be some kind of assault. This negatively affects them. And when you give them ACE scores based on whatever has happened, and up to 40% of them have more than one event that influences them, they are 460% more likely to have depression. Now, if you go back here, I do, and you look right here, which way to turn now? Because this thing is suddenly, okay, it's working, it's moving slides if I hit the button wrong. But if you go from these negative emotions here, it goes right up to depression. So now, let's see if I can do this. These ACE scores, 460% are more likely to have depression. So this model that we've developed, it's consistent with that. And there's some other things here. An ACE score of 6 shortens lifespan by almost 20 years. And this is from this very famous study. And we've talked about pituitary adrenal syndrome, so I'm not going to spend time there. And pituitary adrenal syndrome really depends on this emotional memory center, which is not far from our speech center, to kind of take things over and drive everything. And there's this very famous guy, Daniel Goleman, a Harvard psychologist. He's written some incredible books. I'll bet you at least half of you have read Emotional Intelligence. I suspect you're here because you have read it. And he wrote some other books. And his most recent is this book, The Brain and Emotional Intelligence. And if you have time, this is just an incredible book. I'm nursing this dry cough after this cold. So what we see here these are the basic causes for amygdala triggers. One is condescension, others being treated unfairly, being underappreciated, feeling that you are not being listened to, being held to unrealistic deadlines. So if we look here, we're going to look at these negative emotions associated with a severe tragedy. And they both go straight up toward the heart. And that is highly significant. There is a syndrome, and it's called broken heart syndrome. It's really a cardiomyopathy, which means the muscle doesn't work well, but in most instances, we think of cardiomyopathies in modern medical practice. They're usually what we call ischemic. That means the muscle doesn't get the oxygen it needs to have. But in this case, it's not like that. And it's not because the heart valve is bad. And I suspect it has something to do with the autonomic nervous system. But this can lead to all kinds of things: heart failure, ventricular arrhythmias, and even ventricular rupture. And this is well documented. And this model that we're talking about would also predict this. And there's something else that's really interesting in this model on the heart. And the more I spend time with this model, the more I learn from it. If you look right here, you see the heart there, right? You go down here, you see the forearm musculature right there. And you recognize that this area happens to have a lot to do with spine pathology, pain in the neck, pain in the back. Where does angina manifest itself, cardiac angina? Well, it's in the arm. It can be in the neck. It can come out back in your middle of your back. This is no accident. These guys are all tied together. And you say, well, how in the world did you ever figure this out? I didn't. The chakras had it figured out. All I did, because John Cross did, I drew the arrows, and there they were. You just had to take the time to think about it. So this is the power of this. And we'll move forward a little bit more. There's this new science, and I will be honest with you, I do not understand it fully. But here's the net of it. without having to go through and read everything that's there. The net of it is, if you take man or animals and you deprive them, and you make them live in very bad conditions, as those kids in that adverse child experience study, you can have the world's best genes. Sorry, it ain't going to help. And so that there is behavioral development outside of what you get genetically. This is a whole new field. And this model is consistent with that. And that's important to know, too. So, given these examples I've showed you, and I know it's a busy roadmap, and I know you haven't had a chance to look at it, and that can make it more difficult to understand, you should, I hope, at least be interested in how we got there. It might be helpful to know that. So that's where we're going to go. And I'm going to show you the basic steps that were necessary to do this. And the very first step is to know that the Pentagon is very uniquely set up to show biological patterns. It's quite interesting, and I'll show you that. Now, the second step is you have to have some understanding of the chakras, and I'll go through a little bit of the history of who's done what. And then we'll talk about how the Chinese married their patterns to the Pentagon. And then this brilliant guy named John Cross, he has 2 PhDs, so I was being funny when I put PhD squared, because he does have 2 PhDs, one in acupuncture and one in physical therapy. And then this guy here came along and said, well, can't we just draw these lines across and make some archetypes? So that's where we're going to go. So first step is to take a look at a... I will be glad when this is done. This cough. If you look at any... This is a pentagon, and it's a regular pentagon. And a regular pentagon is created when all the angles are equal and it's defined inside a circle. That's the condition for a regular pentagon. You have to make them that way. And when you do that, if you take this line segment, this cocycle, and you do this cocycle, and then you look at this ratio of AB to C, right there, B, when you do that, and it comes out to 1.62, you go, wow, because that is the number called the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is extremely important, because once you see that, that means what you stumbled across is the number for biological proportions. And the world is kind of set up to reflect those biological proportions. Now, the next step is to know conceptually what is a chakra. Now, if you know a little Sanskrit, and I know zero other than this, which is to say the word chakra means wheel or disc. And what this is referring to is a wheel of energy. Some like to call this an energy vortex. And that gets some people very upset because it just seems like it's way out there in touchy-feely land. But there's no other way to say it. This is probably at a level of these very tiny photons that we think are now responsible for the control of intracellular processes, on the order of trillions in a day. But at any rate, the 7 main chakras, Deepak says, align to the spine, starting from the base to the top of the head. And we've been talking about this since 600 BC, and the issue is, and this is one of the, I wouldn't call it the discouraging part of this, it's the tantalizing part. And that is that there are some individuals, you meet them, and they look at a person and they say, I see your first chakra is a little out of line today. There are not too many of those people on the planet, but some of those that are and have academic credentials, they've really had a major effect on at least me and my thinking, and we will talk about some of those people. Me personally, I have no difficulty on a good day, if I take my hand and I put it in front of a white wall, I see a little blue outline. It's very faint, but it's there. I'm not making it up. It's there. And what we think is going on is that as we mature, our cortex, 75% of our cortex in some way interacts with what we see. And we think what happens is it's like a piece of art. You sort of map out what you think the art should be. And you kind of get rid of all that periphery, and you just deal with the people that you're looking at. On the other hand, you're going through the art gallery, you're with your wife, and she says, look at this. And you look and you realize you never even saw it, but it was there all the time. It's one of these things that I think we'll find. And then there's some physical scientists that actually found ways of measuring this. I'm so sorry for this, but I can't. And this is Vermont, and this is the season. So this is a quote from a Buddhist philosopher, Michio Kushi. And one of my friends lived with Michio. He's an interesting character. I love stories, and this man and his wife, they're quite famous for their macrobiotic diet. And my good friend Martin lived with him for a while. And Michio is really a first-class mind. And he thought we had yin and yang mixed up. Martin was telling me this week that he thought that our yang was really yin and our yin should be yang. But at any rate, he writes this little lucid piece that John Cross quotes in his book. And it meant something to me, so I'm actually going to read it out loud to you. Heaven's force tends to charge the right side of the brain, whilst the Earth's force charges the left side. Now, the minute I read that, I said, oh my goodness, we are in the 21st century with these chakras. If this is what they thought back then, they've got it. Because so much of our understanding of the modern brain, from MRI work, and there's just oodles of it. We could talk all night on this. But we know we have a left frontal executive center. We know we have a right frontal emotion processing center. We know we've got these pesky amygdalas that tend to get in there and cause PTSD and all this other stuff. But we're talking about ancient people really getting the fact that the left and the right brain are different. And it means if we make a model using chakras, we can bring this 5-phase model up into the 21st century. The minute I read this, I thought, there is a chance that the West can talk to the East. Because right now, and I'm not being critical of it, if you look at anything on standard 5-phase Chinese theory, you'll find that the personality elements are played by the organs. Like there's liver anger, okay? There's kidney anxiety and fear. It's not like this comes from the brain. It comes from the organ, like playing a role on the stage. And it would be very helpful in dealing with modern physicians if you said, oh my heavens, this is a left brain function. So you remember I said this when we actually look again at this whole thing. And you'll be quite interested to know that the right brain and empathy line up in this model. And I think that's where it gives us a little bit of a head start in maybe bringing East to West. But I have digressed, and so I will keep going. So we need to look at what artists have seen. So if you look at artists and what they've seen, this is one of the interpretations. And I want you to notice two things. You don't have to memorize these things. It just isn't necessary. But you notice that these chakras, they have the arrows here. The concept is that they exchange energy and information with the environment and bring it in. And secondly, there's one in the front and the back in every case except for the crown and the root. The root attaches you to earth. The ancient Chinese saying, man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Now the question to think about is, what is heaven? What is heaven? Is it the timeless dimension, where time doesn't matter, and the earth dimension is here, where it does? Makes you think. And then around the entire body are these aura. And it can get quite complicated, and we're not going to go there, because it will cover up what we want to know. We want the main forest here today. We don't have time to get into all the trees. The diagrams show them, and if you want some slides from me afterward, we can talk about it. But probably the best person, my go-to source for trying to understand what the human aura looks like is Barbara Brennan. How many people know Barbara Brennan at all? Who am I talking to? What an incredible woman. She is trained as a psychotherapist, a NASA physicist who was spending her time predicting the weather. She has a PhD, and I have to tell this story because without the stories it's no fun. And Barbara was in the Watergate complex, and there was the Washington riot. If you've read her book, then you know this story, but some people haven't, so I have to share this story about her. And she went to the top of the Watergate complex to look at all the rioters, and she wanted to know how close it was coming and all this. And she looked over there, and she could see their auras were all red. And Barbara, in her entire life, had not wanted to let anybody know that she could do this. She would go into a bar, she would watch a man meet a woman. It was like a real-time video game. She'd watch their auras kind of meet and kiss type thing. And her book, it begins with a discussion of classical all the way through quantum physics and DNA. And then she goes on from there. And she works with a professional artist for this book. She wrote 2 books, Hands of Light and Light Emerging. I commend them to you, but hold on to your seats. It's not going to be an easy ride if you're a Western doc, but it is incredible reading. This is what, I'm going to move over here because I don't want to spend too much time on the layers of the aura. If you look, here's what Barbara sees in a woman with a ventral hernia. And she's describing to the artist what she's seeing, and there she is. She's trying to help the woman. And what's in Barbara's book can't be described here in this lecture. But I commend her to you. I think your life will be far richer if you read her. And then there's another guy. And I found him on the internet, and I've been chasing him on the internet now. And this is Konstantin Korotkov, who is chairman of physics at St. Petersburg University. Now, the story behind this is that in St. Petersburg, Russia, there are, and you know, this is the former Stalingrad, where they survived World War II. There are these underground rivers. They're major underground rivers. This is known. And what was also known by epidemiologists, Russian epidemiologists, was that if you lived over these underground rivers, your health wasn't as good as if you lived somewhere else. And so Konstantin Korotkov, he's a physicist, and we physicists think we can explain everything. He said, okay, there's got to be some sort of energy, and I'm going to develop a machine to measure it. And you read his books, and you think you're reading Barbara Brennan, except Barbara's out there. I mean, he doesn't heal, he observes, but he's a wonderful writer. And here's his little device. Here's something he took before and after meditation. This woman. That's her aura as he sees them with his device and his software. This little creature here, that's a titanium cylinder. What he has right there right now, he has plugged into it a special antenna, but sometimes when he's looking at a person, he takes the antenna out and he lets the photons from the person come into this. They hit a plate that produces an electric current that gets modified and processed. And he's still doing work, and he's said up to 21 PhDs in his department were working on this problem. So if someone says to you, well, there's no real true physical evidence that there's any kind of aura, oh no, there are people out there doing some really incredible work. I say in 10 years from now, you walk into a doctor's office, he picks up something the size of an iPad, it's got a handle on it, and takes a look at you. Mrs. Jones, what happened yesterday? But that's my dream. But anyway, so here we are. So one of the things about chakras is they are not divorced from emotion, and this has been talked about for not just centuries, millennia. And one of my favorite drawings, I just love it because it's simple. And sometimes simple is where we want to be. And this says, I am, I feel, I do, I love, I speak, I see, and then I understand. What do you understand? Your tie to everyone else. What do you see? Your purpose and what you should be doing. And I speak, this is you speak what you assess is happening to you. You are self-aware. This is what the fifth is all about. The fourth, it's rather interesting. These are the earth chakras. Oh, I did it. These are the earth chakras, and they are tied to the spiritual chakras, and the heart's right in the middle. Now, not many people realize this, but the highest amount of neuropeptide in the human body outside the human brain, guess where it is? Anybody? It's the heart. And what do we learn out of the Stanford heart transplant program? And about 10% of the people, you transplant their heart, you transplant their personality too. And that includes their language. Somebody gets a kidney transplant, that's second in line. And there's this wonderful story. It's a book called The Heart's Code by Paul Pearsall. And if you really want to read some fascinating stuff, there's just one story after another. I don't even have time to tell you any of them. But this heart, when you say you felt in your heart that it was the right thing to do, it's not kidding. It's a lot more than a pump. In fact, the human heart sets out a frequency, and there's a Heart Math Institute, which if you haven't looked at their webpage, you should. The heart broadcasts a frequency, and when you're in distress, it's all over the place. And when you're happy and sensing love, or you just kissed your kids goodnight, and you're feeling how wonderful it is to be a parent, and nobody's sick, and you can actually get some sleep, you get one frequency out of this thing. So enough comment there, or we will not get to the meat and potatoes. This is a drawing I made. It's as much an artist you're going to get out of me. And the only thing about this is that chakras don't serve alone. They've always said to couple with one another, which is one of the nice things of putting on the pentagon where they can really show how they couple. But here again, this idea there's just some emotion associated with the chakras, and that conveniently their location is specified by acupuncture points on the front and on the back. So there's the back and there's the front, and then there's this idea that you're exchanging information. There are those arrows, and they're supposed to look like a flower, so that's how I did it, and that was in my article. So the next person that I wanted to talk to you about is Carolyn Myss and C. Norman Shelley. Does anybody know who C. Norman Shelley is? Anybody here? Oh, good. Well, I have to keep these in here so we don't cough. So C. Norman Shelley is a neurosurgeon, and he's a famous neurosurgeon because he's the first guy to put a nerve stimulator for the treatment of chronic pain into the spine. So he is really special. And Carolyn Myss is equally special. She was really a theologian. She had a master's degree in theology. She was working in this little book publishing house, and she was studying the religions of the Indian tribes of North America. And she went up, and she had quite an experience there. She came back, and she was reading Joseph Campbell. And how many people know Joseph Campbell here? Everybody else. You see, we're all cut from the same thing. He's the guy who was a Western theologian who started writing about the chakra systems. And what Carolyn did, and it really put her on the map, was said, wait a minute, there's 7 chakras, there's 7 sacraments in these major Western religions. It all matches up. And that got her some pretty good publicity. And then her world kind of came apart. This woman came into her office. She said, Carolyn, I've heard that you can do readings. She said, well, yeah. I have a very bad illness, and I want you to look in my chakra and tell me what's going on. How has this happened? And so she did. And right in the middle of this, she said to herself, I'm losing my mind. I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to drive out in the countryside, and I'll come back. Maybe. Well, she did. And she started going to medical conferences. I'm so sorry. And she met C. Norman Shelley. And I don't know how he'd heard about her, but he says he had, and what he liked about her was her precision. And so they started working together at her pain clinic. And they wrote a book together that I read in 1998 on how to diagnose human illness using the chakras. That changed things for me. So in 2005, I went to acupuncture school at Harvard. And then there's one other person to mention in this story, and that's Eileen McKissick. And Eileen is a Vermonter, and she has a very interesting life. And what she has done is to use tuning forks to identify the chakras, because they're in a vibratory mode. If you take a tuning fork and you pass it over the human body, it turns out that depending upon the wellness or illness, balance of the person, that tuning fork changes, which means you're putting energy in or out. And once you've done that several times, it kind of steadies out. And you can do that, by the way, with a test tube and DNA and infrared light. So I'm going to hide too much away. And you can take also, I should have mentioned with Barbara Brennan, you can take not a plumb bob, but it's a special kind of wood and a string, and hold it over the human heart, and it will start spinning. And I use a quartz crystal and a silver chain, and I can do the same thing. But if I take a scrape of my DNA from inside my mouth, I got the idea to do this the other day. Sam and I had gone for a walk at 4 in the morning. He's my dog, and he decided he had to go out. And sometimes when we go out early like that, I have my inspirations. So I'm walking around, and I'm thinking, why do these things rotate like this? What is going on? I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll scrape some DNA out of my cheek, and I'll put it on a paper towel, and I'll hold this thing above it. And sure enough, it moved. It's resonance. It's molecular resonance in one form or another. And that's what Eileen's all about. That's what she's done. She has a wonderful book, Tuning the Human Biofield, and she teaches courses. And I met her when I was walking Sam. She and her class came out, and they were all over Sam, who's just this wonderful ambassador for me. And then she introduced herself, and her classmates did, and they told me what they were doing. So I got her book, and I started reading, and I figured that was another thing I needed to know. So let's see where we are, because we're almost ready to close the net on how we invented this model. You have met all these characters. I've introduced you to them. You know that there's a thing called Chinese five-phase theory. You don't have to learn it, but you know it exists. And it is only fair to say that there was a physician, J.R. Worsley, and there was a Worsley Institute, and someone here, I think Janet Kahn, was at it, or had something to do with it, and he developed personality archetypes in this old Chinese system. I'm thinking that I'm pointing to something. There we go. You got to go this way, I think. Yep. Okay. So here we are. This guy. So I have to mention his name because other people did recognize the need for archetypes. And then John Cross comes along, this guy who really changed the face of acupuncture, in my opinion, because he wrote he wrote 5 books, actually, and 2 I've read, and it changed the way I thought about acupuncture forever. And this man is gifted in so many ways. He's a wonderful writer. One of the dedications in the front of his book, there's this guy who says, I've never met you, John, but I know you intimately. You have been with me up the walls of the Grand Canyon. You've camped overnight, and he gives all these places where he hauled his book, reading him. And He's such an entertaining reader. And what he said is, we can take these chakras and put them on the 5 vertices of the pentagon. And what I don't understand is why he didn't go from there and say, okay, let's have archetypes. And what he does is, there are Chinese archetypes. They call them the 12 biopsychotypes. That's what Helms calls them. And he would work backwards to those and then hop over to chakra acupuncture. And I said, well, let's not do that. Let's just do it right where you put these chakras. That's where I come into play. And I'll just explain how this is done. What I'm saying is, why not start right here, take 2 co-cycles. We can start here, take a co-cycle, come back over here, and then come up here. And that will define a positive archetype. It's an alpha archetype. You'll see there are 2 names here. One is alpha and mind. My idea was, for international medical conferences, you need to have mathematical symbols so that everybody can be on the same page. Whereas locally, mind means something to us. I don't know what the right word is in Russia. Why should they have to retranslate? Why don't they use this model and put their own word in for mind? So that's why there's 2 things. And the one rule in making these archetypes is negative to negative, positive to positive. When you're just looking between any 2 points, it's perfectly fair to show how a negative influences a positive or a positive and negative. But when you're making archetypes, you know what you're doing? You're making what we call in mathematics boundary values. They're way out on the edge, either on this side or on this side. And then where do we live? We human beings, we're somewhere in between. So what we're going to look at right now are some of these archetypes. I'm not sure we're going to have to look at all of them. When these archetypes are made, the focus is the point where you start. And the expression is where you go to. Focus is like home base. We all have to have a home. Every archetype has to hail from a starting point. Otherwise, they're all mixed up. And then I've talked about the 2 expressions, and we use diagonals because this takes advantage of a principle from Japanese and Chinese acupuncture, but the Japanese talk about it a lot. And that's this idea of crossing on a diagonal through the pentagon. So that's how we're doing this. And this just is saying here that positive to positive, negative to negative. So let's just look at one of them. This is the epsilon. That's its international symbol, or family archetype. Almost did it again. We start right here. This is a person who has family as the primary focus. And that includes the bigger family, the tribe. We want to think here broadly, okay? You don't want to be too restricted by the language. And if your favorite emotion is missing, well, then stick it in there. I had to go through books on books. And there was, I don't know if you've read Anania Judith. Have any of you read her stuff? She has a wonderful book on the psychology of the chakras. It was very, very helpful. And Barbara Brennan had her thing, and Carolyn has hers, and John has hers. And you will find that everybody agrees. So I kept going through, and finally I said, okay, it's my call. So I set them in here. But if you'll realize how this is if you study Buddhism and its view of negative emotions. They start with 21 negative emotions. They actually start with 3. Then they go to 21, and they end up at 84,000. And you can read all about this in Daniel Goleman's book, Destructive Emotions, which was one of the last books I gave to my father, who was an incredible man. He finally died at 102. But in his mid-90s, he was reading this, and he loves psychology. And he called me up and said, "Chris, you've got to read this book." And one of my real treasures is his copy of this book with all his notes all around the edge of this book. But starting here, so we start here with this concept of family and abundance. We tie that with empathy. Who wouldn't want to be in this family where they're loving and there's a high regard, we're all tied to one another, and over here we have wonderful awareness of how important this is, we network with ourselves and comes back and supports this. So that's a positive epsilon. And there, of course, is a negative epsilon, where everything is scarce. It's one of these people that's trying to get in the United States and their family's broken apart. And that leads to a sense of delusion and detachment and sadness and melancholy. And it comes over here to where you're grieving all the time and you're not linked and you're not tied in. And that is a negative family archetype. So each one has a positive and a negative. I'll do one more, and then we'll go look at a case, okay? Because I'm telling you enough so you can understand the cases. The next one is alpha archetype, and that's when we go from right here to here and over to here. What kind of a president of the United States do we want? Do not say Donald Trump right now. If we want someone who's innovative, rational, complex thinker, stable, and capable. With great willpower. That's a positive alpha. Similarly, we have a negative alpha. Whoop. This is someone who's angry and irrational, jealous, depressed. Don't want him. Full of self-doubt, sense of scarcity. So, archetypes are either balanced or unbalanced. If you're positive, you're balanced. If you're negative, you're unbalanced. So, we're going to look at this patient here with IBS. And this patient, he was really quite a fellow. He had worked as a leader all his life. He'd spent $25,000 outside of insurance with no control of his problem. And he suffered from chronic anxiety and internalized anger because he had to fire people that he really liked. And he worked in a very advanced, high-tech, super-secret area. He had PhDs and master's degree people that he had to let go. And that really affected him. And he had joint replacements. He had hypertension, cold feet and ankles. So what I'm setting up here is a person who's sympathetically driven from his anger. He's both an alpha, negative alpha, and he's a negative epsilon. He has both of these items to work with. He also had liver disease, and if you probably can't remember because you hardly know this, but if you go back here, if you go over from this to this, the liver meridian is over here in the liver. So this negative influence should damage his liver according to this model, because there's this concept of liver anger, and it's still preserved even though we're using this modern approach. So he had these two negative archetypes, and the question is, what did I do to help him? And really, what I did, I knew right away that, and if you work in acupuncture and you're an acupuncturist and you hear this story, you know right away that you have to deal with the kidney meridian, because the kidney meridian is associated with the root chakra. You're tied to the earth. And there are problems that occur. Do you have Kleenexes anywhere here? I'm sorry to be doing this. Thank you. anyway, from an acupuncture point of view, now that you know the kidney meridian's involved, what you must do is you take and examine the abdomen. And there are places on the abdomen that are associated with the kidney meridian. So I treated that for sure. And I went all over this man's body, finding these, what are called acupuncture reflexes, where you press, you get a pain, and you have another spot that relieves it, and you put needles there on the point that releases. So this is all described right here, this section right there. And I'm not going to read it all because it wouldn't mean anything to you anyway. The point is, I knew from the chakras, I'm good, a woman kindly gave me. From the chakras, I went right at it and just treated him. Well, the long-term course of this man was that he stopped having irritable bowel syndrome. He got relief for the first time in 10 years. And we treated him for his insomnia and all of this other stuff. And in the middle of all of this, he said to me, my physicians would like to go ahead and they would like to do a liver biopsy. What do you think of that? Well, I knew what I thought. I thought that was absolutely crazy. But on the other hand, I knew that that wasn't my call, and to make it my call would really be unethical. So he did have his liver biopsy, and he was sick as not for a long time. But he got better. And then he was doing well, and he came in one day, and he said, I have the strangest symptoms. I cannot open a jar of peanut butter. I said, what? When did that start? And he told me it had just been in the last week. And I said, well, I'll tell you what. I'll put the acupuncture needles in. We'll give you your treatment, but then you must go to the emergency room, which he did. And then he went to the intensive care unit because they did a CAT scan and found that he had a narrowing of his cervical cord. And if you know the pathology associated with the root chakra, that's one of the things. So then he had an operation, and he got better, and he came back, and we were treating him. And then finally our experiment closed, and we didn't treat him anymore. But he was a great example of where, from knowing his chakras, I knew right where to go. And for his anger, I kept giving him yin tang, day after day, and ear treatments to get him to sleep, to try to help him out. And then I have one other little case, and then we'll have some questions. I'm going to move forward here. I can just point out something. When I analyze how someone's doing, say their alpha archetype is anger, it's important to realize that when you're using this model, no point is out of reach of the other points. So right here, this first cold cycle, this alpha archetype right here, has influence coming from every part of the pentagon. Yes, its primary direction is this way, but it comes from over here. And a good example would be a young man who starts working out and he gets physically buffed. And before he was such a nasty, angry guy, and now you meet him again, you can't believe how he's settled. That is from going, see if I can figure this out, how to do it. All right, it's one more over, I can see. I can use this. That is from going back this way, because he now becomes stable and capable, and his athletic achievements settle him down, and now he turns out to be rational instead of angry. So it works both ways. So this man like this, he's so accomplished. He's done all these wonderful things. He's been burdened with this grief that he has had over having to fire people. And that's part of this epsilon archetype, because remember, you go here to here to here, and here we have this grief. So this man lived with this chronic grief of having to let people go that he didn't want to let go. So is there a message in this? So I'm going to tell you another case which will give, if I know where I am, that's just more on this alpha archetype. And I want to go to this patient with carpal tunnel. And I don't know why it's doing what it's doing. For some reason, let's just try to go forward. I know the case well enough, I can present it, but what's confusing me is, well, it's like we have one case on top of another. I'm not sure. Well, I know the case well enough that I can tell you about it. I was consulted by this young man who had wonderful skills, and he worked with his hands, and his family had had some difficulties where his parents were no longer well, and he had 2 small children, and he had his wife, and he started to getting these symptoms of carpal tunnel syndrome. And the next thing he knew, he was having insomnia as he worried, because he thought, what happens if I can't use these hands? Everything goes down. And I made this mistake last week, and he started perseverating on these issues. So he really had no anger. He's had fear. He's an epsilon. It's this. He wants to be loving to his family. And the problem he's having is his self-awareness. That's how I'm putting him together. And and the kidney meridian is involved here because we're in this part of this. And you can't read it very well, but that's KI for kidney. And so I right away found his spots on his kidney meridian that needed treatment using an exam of his abdomen. And then I started talking to him to get at the bottom of what was really driving him. Because he first came in and talked about his carpal tunnel. And I said, no one is perfect. You're doing the best job you can. I know how good your work is, and you need to realize that you're gifted, and you just have to accept the fact that you can only be as good as you can. And you just must let yourself go. And what was I trying to do? I was trying to teach him to have self-compassion. And one of the really important messages in this wonderful book that Daniel Goleman wrote with the Dalai Lama called Destructive Emotions, there's this marvelous piece in there on this Buddhist word, and I don't know how to pronounce it, or I would have put it up there, but it's Tsewa. And it means to have compassion for self. And that is one of the things that's missing in our culture. We're wondering what's going on. We're wondering why we're having all this conflict. The geometry of emotions diagram convinces me I can get it. I know why. Part of the answer is we need to start recognizing we all have worth, and we need to stop critiquing ourselves night and day, and we need to recognize that we are all trying to do the same thing, which is to take care of our families. In vast majority, that's the case. And anyone who practices acupuncture will tell you that the great majority of patients come with problems here and problems here. And that's even in classic medical acupuncture. Forget my model. Our ability to assess ourselves and recognize our worth is a major issue of health. And I feel that part of what I've learned from this model is how important it is to have self-compassion. It's just critical. And so I counseled him to this effect. I treated him for 2 weeks in a row, and all his symptoms were gone. They just disappeared. Now, why did I put him in the same lecture as the previous guy? What's the difference? The previous guy had no one to talk to. He had nobody to go to. He had the same situation. He had a family who needed him, kids that need to go to college. It's a terrible job, and he sucked it up, and all that went inside. And the message is pretty clear to me. We need to teach compassion. It's one of the critical things. No matter what you do in medicine, you must do that. And East can meet West in this model. There is nothing that I've talked about tonight that requires sort of a hokey-pokey fancy thing. We can all sign up for this. So that's the basic message here from this model. how important it is to recognize the power of negative destructive emotions and how self-compassion, thinking positively, seeking out help, working together can be helpful to us. And I'd love to hear your questions. So please go right ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering what determines what archetype someone lands on. Is it purely the environmental impact of stressors in their life, or is there like a genetic or a physical component?
I don't know the answer to that question. Good luck. Isn't it true from this model that there are diverse inputs? And how many of us have had a particular situation arise on a particular day where someone says, well, would you go do this? And you're about ready to go do this. And someone says, no, I really need you over here. You go over there and you find had you gone down that road, something really horrible would have happened. It's like irreversible thermodynamics in predicting the weather. There's no way you can wrap your arms around it. It's too complex. What I do is I look at this model and that I was showing you, and I say, okay, what can I do here in this instance to make a difference? How can I get, if we're negative, how can we get positive? Okay, first you, and then back up there. Okay.
So you were mentioning, first of all, you're very brave in presenting this topic in the way you did, so thank you very much. But my question is, you mentioned, like in a hypothetical future what you wish is like for some of us colleagues to make some diagnosis using an iPad or something that will identify the aura and the ability to diagnose that way of Asia, which I find fascinating. Don't you think that there might be some connection in a damaging sense between our over-reliance on technology and the way that could possibly negatively impact our ability to reconnect to some of those chakras, namely the fact that maybe over-reliance on, communication through, cell phones instead of one-to-one could possibly negatively impact our ability to reconnect or not.
I think everything has a two-edged sword. I don't care what it is that you have. There's nothing for free. I've often said that the closest thing I know to getting around the bases for free is medical acupuncture, because in modern medicine, nothing is for free. Oh, we'll fix this hernia. Well, sir, we got in there and we nicked this or that, and 6 weeks later. I agree with you. When you bring technology into a picture, if you misplace it, if you overuse it, if you forget that the person across from you is a total person. And don't get the idea from my pointing out that this is an alpha or an epsilon. Don't think the other parts of the chakras aren't working. They're all going. It's just at any given moment, you get it. It's like taking a picture in time, since we're in a time-dependent universe. And there's that person right there. And what you don't want to see happen, whether you're using technology or if it's just you and you're laying on of hands, you don't want the system to go negative. I think that that's what can happen. I've watched it happen in people's lives. They get a little... How many have watched an athlete just go nowhere on one team, and they get transferred, they go to another team, and you can't believe it's the same person? Well, sometimes we stay at what we're doing too long, and what we need to do is go have a fresh start. And to your point, I don't diminish it at all. I just don't know how to quantitate it. Just remember that in the end, take away all the machines, it's still you and the patient. And always treat the patient with respect, and I think you'll be fine. And I think ultimately, when you can see a disturbance, it's like a hint. You then have to ask the question, why, what's going on? Now, I think in some things, like, for instance, in Russia, the stuff that Konstantin Korotkov has been working on, they've actually licensed it as a preventive medicine technique. They're actually talking about that. You can find him on the internet. You can buy his device. You have to subscribe to his software. And it's not because he's Russian. It's just I just don't see enough to convince me. I don't know. I'm not sure that he's got part of the answer, but I'm not sure that he's got all of it. I'm back to trying to figure out why these crystals I'm using rotate the way they do, and the fact that they will do that over external DNA really excites me. And what I think I'm going to end up doing is using a lot more tuning forks. And I'd like to have one that has a pickup on it and tie that to an oscilloscope and try and see what I'm actually seeing. But question in the back. You're welcome.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate your topic. And so I think you answered some of what I was going to ask. But do you also see an openness in other hospitals around the country or in institutions where the word chakra is accepted and not questioned? Or do you feel like there's another roundabout avenue to address the same topic that would be more accessible? Personally, the word chakra is what brought me here tonight. So I think it's great that that word, is out there. But I'm just wondering, do you see that there's an openness?
Well, it depends on where you go. Now, here's an interesting story I'll share with you. When I finished the Harvard acupuncture piece, which was 300 CME hours and 2 semesters, and I came back, and then Howard and I put our heads together, and I agreed I'd start a research clinic. And I was going on vacation, and I said, I'm going to go out, and I'm going to see Emily Ratner at Stanford, because they were offering for pain fellows an acupuncture fellowship. And I thought, I want to go see this. Well, they didn't have anybody taking it when I was there, but I did talk to Emily, and she's no longer there now, but I talked to her. And here's this separate building. The hospital is a couple blocks. You can see it, okay? And I said, I want to set up a clinic, Emily, and, how do we make this thing go financially? And she said, well, I'll tell you what we've done. And I didn't ask her the price because you can't do that because that's illegal, and I didn't feel like going to jail. She just said, this is how it's done. A patient comes in here, and I fill out all their Medicare forms, but they have to sign a statement that what I'm doing that isn't covered by insurance, they have to pay. Now, in California, you can do that, but you can't do it in Vermont. It's like a poison pill. So you can say the word chakra all you want here, but you cannot get paid for what you're doing. Now, it's probably true that I would have never come upon this theory had I been treating patients every day. I'm sure I would have been reading about what's the next patient, trying to find some clever set of meridians that go together to work on something, because trust me, there are so many different ways to treat the same thing in acupuncture. I've heard, not Eileen, but Helene. I always mix Eileen and Helene up, but Helene Langevin, I've heard her talk about, finding the irreducible number of acupuncture points, how wonderful it would be to know what the minimum is. You can have people come in with the same problem and two have it a different way. But practically speaking, right here, we're behind. And we're behind because we need to make an exception. If we're going to have innovative, low-risk treatments, for instance, at our pain center, we could use that, but you can't make it a viable go. And another thing against it, Emily was off in her own building. She had with her some acupuncturists. She had a PhD acupuncturist. She had an MD who was primarily an anesthesiologist who would come and work a day a week. And you know what her other job was? Her other job was just to put the conferences together. So she was running this thing and trying to do research at the same time. And they had their own little building, and she told me they were going to build them an even bigger building. And I said, well, what's the real issue? And she said, well, I get everybody at the end. after everyone has worked on someone and they've got all these things wrong, finally in the end they say, well, let's send them to medical acupuncture. And my point of this model is right along we should be looking at a patient's energy balance. This shouldn't be something we discover at the 11th hour when they're about 6 weeks before they die. We don't want to go there. Like it or not, we all have energy balance. We all have to pay attention to it, and it's part of health. And this isn't something that was newly discovered. I know I'm speaking extensively on what you asked, and I'm wandering a little bit. I have to tell you this quote, and it was in Helms. And I think the title of his book was Acupuncture Energetics. I don't think I'm mixing that up with Mark Seam's book, which is very similar in title. And he's got this quote from a 14th or 13th century acupuncturist, and the acupuncturist said, the greatest doctor of all is the one who anticipates his patient's energy change that will occur, okay, will occur, and treats him for it before it happens. And then he goes down to this excessive list of all these lesser beings, and then he says, the least doctor is the one who treats the patient after he's ill. And I'm thinking, okay, that's nice. I know where I am. But to your point, you can talk this stuff, but practically, I think there are many other states like Massachusetts and New York that are much more friendly to the idea of someone practicing acupuncture as part of medical practice. You have to meet certain criteria, like you have to take the Harvard course, and then you can advertise it.
Do all medical acupuncturists have to understand the chakras? Is that part of the training?
No. They mentioned it, but you have to understand that predominantly this has been Chinese medical acupuncture for millennia. And now we come along with John Cross writing about this, and there's a famous quote. I call it a famous quote. It was from my colleague, our colleague, Don's here, Rob Williams, saying he went to the Harvard course after I got him interested in it, and he said, learning acupuncture is like eating soup with a fork. And what makes it hard, part of it is that the models are not congruent with the way we think of Western medical science. This model is much more congruent. Left brain, right brain, things are laid out. You've got your nervous plexi, they're all tied in. Their 5-phase I'm not criticizing them, I'm just saying, over time, this model has advantages. And then back up there. Well, on October 1, I stepped down after 40 years. So I'm not counseling anybody right now. My goal is to develop a company that specializes in medical education of various types. But one of the parts that I'm really focused on is medical acupuncture. I like the idea of, for a physician who wants to know something about medical acupuncture, they can call me up and say, well, what do I read? And I'd like to have a course for them. I'd like to be able to go into their practice, and we agree that I'll show up 3 days a week, 2 hours a day to give them a hand. I still have a license. I paid for the money, so I'd have it. They'll have to cover my malpractice and everything else, but the risks on acupuncture are minimal. But did I use this kind of information when I counseled people? Yes, but it wasn't with this robust a model. But I'd done a lot of reading the chakras beforehand. The model didn't come into full-fledged until April of 2018, which is an interesting story in itself. One of my, I've written books, and one of the books I wrote was with my kids in mind. I wrote this book called Arthur Eagle. And I wanted to make an illustrated version. So I decided I would learn how to draw the human face. And this was not an easy task for me. And I was with Sam, and I was on the back porch, and I was drawing away. And finally I said, okay, this is enough of this. Why don't we think about acupuncture? And by now, I knew all the phases, and I knew the emotional things with the chakras. And I drew the circles and set up the pentagon, and I'm looking at it, and I think, well, what if we went and did this? And I said, wait a minute, I know this person. It was an alpha. And I said, what do we call the one up here? Because I think I know him too. And that became beta. And that's how that happened. It really happened that way. I mean, the frustration in one thing, there was something else that got delivered. And then when I realized what was involved, I said, well, okay. Because I was writing a book at the time, and I said, you got to put this in the book, and you got to write this paper. And it took a while, but I got it out there. And now my focus is on my writing and trying to do something in medical education, and perhaps if I can get it organized, another National Institutes of Health grant. There are colleagues here that are interested in that if it was in the right way, but it's just me. So you gotta, and I want to have some fun with my family, so I have to lay it out carefully. Yep. Well, we've known each other for some time. No, we've known each other, and it's now that I'm retired that I have time to do this. Is, I can lay out my schedule. I find that I have, as my wife correctly predicted, I have more than I want to do in the hours that are available. Even though I'm no longer in the OR, there seems to be no shortage of projects. Yeah.
One more, and then we should wrap it up because we're getting close to 7:30.
Okay.
It seems like I went with the UVM group to Cuba, and thinking about some of the things I saw there, and they don't have much money, they use these things first in neighborhood clinics and things. And I wonder how much, and if you could comment, is part of our cultural expectation that the best care is the most expensive, or that it has to be evidence-based if we did this first and something went wrong? You know, well, you didn't do Western medicine first, which is evidence-based, and it seems like what you're establishing might go well for setting up research that would make this more evidence-based. But would you comment on that?
All of that? Sure. Well, on the point of the model and it being a foundation for studies, absolutely. That's why I built the model. I mean, the first step is to take 100 surgical cases, 100 medical cases, 100 psychiatric cases, and profile them according to the model and write a paper. It's not rocket science, but it should be done. And I'll bet you that could get funded. The second point you're driving at is how we spend money. And I wish I knew more about this topic. I've called around, I've talked to some people. I ran into Bernie Sanders one day. I love this interaction. His wife was with him, and they're really a nice couple. And I saw him, and I told him what I did for work, and he pointed his finger right at my chest, and he said, well, I don't think we're getting our money's worth. And then they had to go do something, and I wanted to say, what I really wanted to say to him is, you have to realize that part of our educational system is working against us. I am not one to say that, oh, big pharma is opposed to this or that. There's just a long-term tradition in U.S. medical schools not to delve heavily into acupuncture. That is not true for chiropractic. It's not true for osteopathic medicine. It certainly is not true in Europe. if you go to a German medical school and you come out, you are going to know some acupuncture. And a lot of the major work has been done in the German. There's wonderful trials on back pain, on knee pain. And out of those trials has come what? Some American doctors who have a lot of fingers on money pies have been very disturbed by, and that is that there's this off-point acupuncture points have in some instances had greater effect than the point that was chosen. I look at the studies, and from my understanding of what it is to be a good acupuncturist, as a Japanese acupuncturist, where you drive for, I'll finish, you drive for energy balance, then you treat the particular offending element. These trials didn't do that. This model, if it were to support research in a device that could physically measure what the chakras are experiencing when you put in acupuncture needles, because in reality, when you study John Cross's work, every acupuncture point is at least a minor point. It might be a minor chakra point. There are 20 of those, 21 of those. And then there are the 7 major points. Okay? When you stick a needle in a patient, it's a bimetallic strip, okay? It's 2 metals. A lot of people are confused. They think, oh, I'll just stick this needle in there. No, it's a thermocouple. It's generating an electric current. All right? So don't tell me that an off-point acupuncture point is innocuous. You put electric current in the human body. How dare you suggest that that is a true control? It's not. And it's because we tried to marry traditional Chinese acupuncture to Western methodology. It's a complete snafu. I think if we did chakra acupuncture, we'd stand a much better chance. We'll need some instrumentation, but if we get it, then we'll have what we don't have. No one can tell you today that you put an acupuncture needle in and you know what your effect is. There is no dose-response curve. This is one of the steps. The next is start treating people with chakra acupuncture, get physical instrumentation that can tell you what you're doing. That's why I want to be able to see the aura or measure electric current that comes from them, like Konstantin Korotkov's doing, except he boosts the patient. He has them put their finger in this little device that gives not a shock, but it gives a stream of electric current into the body, and then that radiates out of the body, and then he measures it with his device. Okay? And that's all part of the problem here. You put the quarter in the machine. But that's part of the issue. So education, the way these experiments have been approached, I mean, there are over 300 clinical trials on back pain, and in the American College of Physicians recommends acupuncture as the intervention of choice for level 1 and level 2 types of back pain. And do we have that? No. And it's because of this other stuff, and it's in the way. And every single time that, say, a legislator wants to appropriate money in a time when there is no money, and then someone throws at them some of this disturbing experimental science data, they're done. And that's what's happened here in this state. There are 5 states in the United States that support Medicaid for acupuncture. There is no medical acupuncture for Medicare, even though this is the lowest risk form of treatment available in the world, period. And all these other places, which Senator Sanders is worried about, who have such a cheaper cost of care, they all support medical acupuncture. The British have written in there, it was either Lancet, I think it was Lancet, they said you can't run that system without medical acupuncture. So I'll stop.
Thank you.
Gosh, I didn't cough for almost 30 minutes.
How subsided. Sorry, we just gotta
That's
keep
fine.
it to our timing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. At least I got the talk done within 55 minutes.
Yes, you did great. Let's hang this call up. Hopefully it recorded.
Thank you, John. Oh, it officially happened.
Thank you.
That's why I'm able to do this
Your mic
stuff.
is still on.
Tremendous.
Oh, yeah? I figured it out at the last second.
Very much.
See you, David.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night.
Yes, yes,
Please do.
yes.
Hey.
was on the floor next
Oh,
to where I was sitting. So
okay.
maybe someone
Someone left it.
It's a pretty bracelet.
Yes.
Someone would like it.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Putting this on.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Bye bye.